You ever have that thing where you sneeze and then you sneeze hard enough that you bite the side of your tongue? I did that. My tongue is very slightly swollen. It's quite painful. So I'm hoping that that doesn't impair my ability to speak effectively, or that my tongue doesn't swell up to completely occlude my mouth. That would not be how I would want Thursday to go. Okay, so this next section is a relatively short one, again, with an eye to not overburdening people excessively with lecture material, films, student presentations. I'm trying to remain cognizant of people's time demands. I also, frankly, don't want to load people up too much immediately before the long weekend because I want people to relax. Similarly, I try to arrange things so that you're doing a minimum amount of stuff over reading weeks. In my opinion, reading weeks, yeah, you can read if you want to, but it should be pleasure reading. You need downtime. Anyway, so long weekend, not too burdensome. But I mentioned that I would cover off a certain amount of material here around specifically the watchword matrix. So if you have filled out the watchword matrix, continue now, if you wish. I will explain some things about it. If you have not yet filled out your watchword matrix, stop. Stop. Go fill out your watchword matrix. The instructions are listed. If you go through the announcements, it's there. It's got the whole thing. The sheets are attached. Go do that. If you have not done it, go do it. Don't watch this, okay? Because if you have this information, it may skew your performance on the task, okay? So if you haven't filled it out, stop. Go do it. For the rest of you who have filled it out, you may want to get it in front of you. You could just take this in passively, but if you've got it handy, I'm going to remind everybody, hang on to it. If you need to scan it and send me a copy, or take a photo with your phone and send me a copy so that there is a copy, because the one that I'm having you fill out presently and the one that you are going to write your paper about are the same thing. So if you're the kind of person who, you know, fills out a piece of paper and then it ends up as a piece of like garbage origami underneath the crumbs of countless granola bars at the bottom of your bag, like gingerly set it aside, fold it into your fresh copy of the red book, or snap a photo, give a scan, send it to me now, and then when the assignment comes up next semester where you're doing analysis on this, then I'll be like, here you go, send it back, or you can retrieve it from your own email, okay? If you're an extremely meticulous person who does not lose things or crush things or fold things into garbage origami, good for you. That will doubtlessly actually serve you very well in life because you're probably organized. Okay. I fall closer to the garbage origami category historically. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Watchword. Now, Watchword is a Jungian self-investigation tool. It comes out of a book of the same name. Watchword, Self-Discovery the Jungian Way, I believe is the full title of the book. And I'll have to post up. I don't want to post it up ahead of time just in case people, as I mentioned, right, haven't done it because you can skew. But anyway, I'll post it up and the fellow who wrote it. That's terrible. I should have that on hand. That's extremely bad scholarship on my part. Anyway, I have a copy right there, but I'm not going to go rooting around in my bookshelf to interrupt this video. So the idea with it is that it is a word association task, okay? Which is designed to do a certain kind of like revelatory word association archetypal process for you. Now, the basic principles are this, and you'll catch references to some of the things that I've talked about when I was talking about the general principles of archetypes. The basic system is this. Okay, first off, as I mentioned, pretty much every human culture has some basic associations with up and down as good and bad. And likewise, human beings nearly universally seem to have some associations with right, not so much as good, but as conscious or trustworthy, right? And left, not so much as bad, but as unconscious and not entirely reliable, right? Better conscious control, by and large, in the population for right-handed persons, right? Over the right hand than the left. Okay, now that set of associations, okay, like many other kinds of implicit association processes, is going to tend to have a very faint, influence on the sorts of words that randomly get chosen when you randomly choose them, right? Because here's the thing. Yes, the words that you're choosing are random, but they're nevertheless inflected by things. And there's a huge body in psych, right, of experimental work where you can prime people in various directions, right, to have certain kinds of inflection, tone, etc., on the sorts of words that they choose when they're supposedly making free choices, right? So what the task is ostensibly doing is leveraging that there is a faint coloring, as it were, of good to the up, and a faint coloring of bad to the down, and a faint coloring to the right of conscious, and a faint coloring to the left of unconscious, but faint, right? As is most often the case with association tasks, right? However, there is then this process of synthesis, right? The bringing together, the collapsing together. Now that process in and of itself, people very often report that as they work their way towards the center of the watchword matrix, that there's sort of more grinding, but that the words seem to become more personally related to them in some way, right? Some people, even if they don't know what the structure of the test is, but know that it's in some sense a psychological reflection, start to see very specific emotionally charged things start to jump out, right? The things that they're preoccupied with. Now, of course, you can say chicken and egg, right? You're preoccupied with them. Of course, you're going to think of words in that orbit. But for many people, it's a slightly surprising experience, right? To see as the words at the periphery gradually, right, get synthesized down and start to land with these things that are like of significance to them. Okay. So the idea is that as this collapse is occurring, we're moving closer and closer to the center, but we're also, of course, in some sense, concentrating the implicit association. That's the theory of the test. Now, take it or leave it, okay? I'm not suggesting that this test isn't something that has like an enormous raft of empirical validation behind it, although I have long been interested in doing research around this, and it's something that I kind of pick up and then shelve and pick up and shelve, and I think there's actually potentially really interesting research to be done. I have done, at this point, hundreds of these things, had people do hundreds of them. And people's responses are very interesting. I mean, there do really seem to be some fascinating trends that frankly could have some math thrown at them. I've also done a lot of theoretical elaboration of this in the past 17 years. Oh my God. Yeah, okay. I've done a significant amount of elaboration on it in the last 17 years. It's something I spent a lot of work on in my late 20s. I was really fascinated by the technique and connected it up with a bunch of other things. And we'll see some of those things come out through the course because I think that there's really interesting connections to general narrative theory and a few other things. But we're not going to get into that today. What I do want to get into is, you'll have noticed, okay, so if we take a look at, right, the general sequence, obviously, right, there is the sequence of boxes up top, and we get this general synthesis as we're moving towards the center. And then we have the 11 terms that are in that innermost rectangle, right? The 11 terms that are boxed within the inner rectangle. The 8 that are around sort of the outside, I typically call, and this is my term, not Daniel's, Greg Daniels, Jeff Daniels? Sorry, I should really look up this guy's name. That's rude of me not to, quite frankly. So Daniels, I'm pretty sure it's Daniels. I call those 8 around the outside the annular archetypes. The annular archetypes. The reason being they, my way of thinking, form a sort of outer ring. But the point is, it's the 11 most on the inside that we are concerned with. So numerically speaking, on this particular chart, we're concerned with, let me think, box 25 through to 35, right? 25 through 35 inclusive. And the idea being that those are going to have particular significance. Now, what significance is it that they have, per se, right? What significance is it that they have? Well, if we take a look for a second here, can I switch this over? Okay, if we take a look, you'll see that that the watchword test specifically speaking, refers to each of those 11 terms on the inside by a unique name. And if these names seem to you like they are sort of, archetypal, that's not an accident. So let me just pull open for a sec. Boosh. It's being difficult. It won't just transition. There we go. Aha, okay. So here are the terms that, that the watchword matrix conventionally associates with those innermost 11, okay? And here they are. Okay, so some of these ought to jump at you pretty readily. Wa, persona, soul, shadow, right, okay? So, I mean, you know, the development of this test is explicitly intended to be Jungian. Now, there are some distinctions and differences, okay, between Daniels's original formulation and sort of the Jungian notion, and that will bear some discussion when we get further into this, right? But for now, what I want to do is unpack some of these kind of basic concepts. His last name is definitely Daniels. This is making me nuts. This is not a function of any bit my tongue. It's just a function of, here we go, Daniels. Self-discovery the Jungian way, the watchword technique, Daniels, 1992. Now, I discovered it, as I mentioned, there was a revised edition published in 2014, but I actually found a first edition. I stumbled across this thing at one point, and more or less accidentally. I think at a used book sale, and was immediately fascinated because I had never seen anything quite like it. There are other kinds of tasks and word association tasks, but essentially speaking, what this seemed to represent in some ways was a method of doing a certain amount of archetypal analysis by oneself, right? You know, and of course, I don't think that's a substitute, ultimately speaking, for working with an analyst, but you know, it seemed to yield a remarkable amount of material, notwithstanding. Okay, so very briefly, what are each of these archetypes sort of saying? Okay, so bearing in mind that the synthesis towards this inner box, right, is concentrating some of the influences. We can look at, say, the top right, imago, what's listed as imago here. And what's in the imago slot, okay, is thus a synthesis of, of good, up, right? The tendencies of good, up, and the tendencies of right, conscious. So it's the positive conscious, okay? That is to say that it is, in some sense, the ego ideals. So the imago in this position is the ego ideals. Now, in my experience, that operates both ways. It means that the material that tends to land in that top right corner is both the thing that the ego is sort of striving towards, right? The thing that the ego is striving towards, but it's also the part of oneself that is its inner helper. And when I say helper, I mean helper in the sort of the fairy tale sense. Helpers in the fairy tale sense aren't guides, right? They're not guardians. They don't give you advice. They assist you, right? If you guys have watched The Wizard of Oz, and you should have, the helper in The Wizard of Oz is Toto much of the time. And Toto doesn't offer advice, but he does do things, right? He attempts to assist Dorothy in various ways. He also, of course, initiates the plot in a significant fashion. So it's both the sort of the piece of the psyche that sort of assists you and looks up to you in a very positive way, but also, right, that's when you're inhabiting it. When you're in the space, then something like looks up to you, you know, it's like you feel good, possibly a bit inflated. But it's also the thing that your ego is stretching towards. It's sort of the mark of outer progression, okay? Right, that's the top right. In the bottom right, we have the negative and the conscious, here listed as the specter. I often call this the tyrant, and I'll talk about why shortly. But for this version, the specter, it's if the top right is outer progression, the bottom right is outer regression, okay? So what's outer regression? Problems, anxieties, fears. But more than that, and this is the reason why I like to refer to it as the tyrant, I also see it as demands and skepticism. The tyrant is the world as a you must. It has this constraining factor, right? You must, you must, you must. It's all the things that you must. It is your needs in the outer world, right? The things that you kind of can't get away from in the outer world. Also, right, in the way that the imago has this function of sort of faith, in the way that the helper has faith in you, right? It has a kind of skepticism. So very often this is also where people's sort of inner critic, where their self-critical split resides, right? Because it's skeptical, it's doubtful, it's oppositional, right? Okay, so that's bottom right. It's conscious, but it's negative. Okay, bottom left, unconscious and negative. We have the shadow, right? Inner regression. And it's repressed material, but I'm gonna add sort of an additional layer here and say that I also often call this spot, instead of a shadow, which I think of as kind of a line that you might draw across the whole thing, and I'll talk about that. I think various components can be in shadow. I sometimes refer to this bottom left corner as demon. And why do I refer to it as demon? Because it's inner regression, it's repressed material, but it often is temptation. It plays the function of a contagonist, right? Contagonist. So it's like the impulse is dragging you down. It's inner regression, right? Dragging you back and away from growth, okay? Top left, the counterpoint to this is your guide or guardian, okay? And so this is, if the shadow, or what I call the demon, is inner regression, then the guide is inner progression. It's in some sense your higher self, okay? But it's your higher self, not capital S self, but rather as like a wise old man, wise old woman figure. It has, right, these two figures, right, the guide and the shadow, have this more angel and devil on your shoulder kind of aspect, right, within them. So they don't directly assist you. That's an outer world thing. But instead, what they do is they tempt you, or they offer you good advice, right? So they offer sort of the lamp of wisdom or the lure of temptation, right? So the guide or the guardian in the top left. Okay, then you could think along the top, right? The guide and the imago, which have the left and right, unconscious and conscious aspects, respectively, but nevertheless both carry that upper progressive positive good energy, right? When they synthesize together, they synthesize at the point called the giant, which I sometimes call the hero, okay? Okay, well, the giant or the hero is the point of progression. It is the sum total of all the forces driving you forward and fostering your growth. In that sense, it is the protagonist, okay? The protagonist, literally speaking, in a story. Of course, not every story is it the case that the protagonist and the hero are identical characters, right? But the point is that it has that traditional quality. It's what's moving ahead. It's what's driving development, right? It's a giant because it's big, right? And, you know, from the perspective of the child, adults are giants, right? So the giant or the hero is the mark of progression. It is good, and good is development, right? Appropriate development, appropriate growth. That is the good, okay? Its corresponding slot on the bottom is dwarf, which you could also think of as villain. Dwarf, unfortunately, is a little harsh, obviously, because of chondroplastic dwarves, right? And so on and so forth. So this strikes me as a bit tone deaf. Nevertheless, you know, you could say dwarf or villain, and what we're talking here is about a fairy tale. It's a counterpoint to giant, right? So the idea is that if the giant is progressive, if it's developmentally progressive, if it's the forward arc and the protagonist, the dwarf is the opposite to all of those things, right? So with the sort of conscious, unconscious, inner, outer world aspect of the left and right negated, instead, this bottom thing is just the forces dragging down. It's all the forces in opposition to the giant, right? So there are forces that are driving development and upward ascent, and then there are things driving, dragging you down. These are the things that are stunting you, right? Stunting you, holding you back, opposing you, okay? If we take the four corners here and we synthesize them and synthesize together the positive and negative aspects, but leave the conscious, unconscious aspects intact, right? So we can synthesize together the imago and the specter on the right, and what we get is persona. And what's persona? Persona is outwardness, precisely like the Jungian persona. It is outwardness. It then synthesizes the positivity and negativity of those things relative to the outer world, and it's that outward projection, right? Persona. Very often it carries a strong note depending on your functions, if you've already watched the functions video. So for people who are, strong thinking dominant, it often carries a highly rational kind of character. For people that are strong feeling, it carries a highly emotional, feeling-based character. But the point is that its primary function is that it is the sort of central, basic, outer kind of aspect of the personality. Okay, and on the flip side, what do we have? Soul. So where the guide, right, the wise old man, and the shadow, the demon, right, when those things synthesize, what do you get? You get in the middle soul. And soul has that corresponding, right, again, transjective. It has that corresponding aspect of personality. It's the point of view that, or the part of you that points inward. It is inwardness, right? You're sort of the basic personality structure that is your inner personality, right? Facing inward, soul. And likewise, okay, the aspects of that are foregrounded may have something to do with your personality, right? Okay. So that's what I call the annular archetypes, right? Around the edge. And I would, suggest, take a look and reflect. I'm not giving you an exhaustive version of these terms, partly because I am going to give you a much longer document, but closer to the time when you are actually writing the analysis on this. But for now, I hope, take a look and see what resonates for you here. Are there things that jump out? Does this stuff seem on point? Does it seem radically off point? If so, why, right? My experience is that most people find it highly resonant, okay? And I don't want to universalize anything. There's no tool that is a good fit for everybody. But I, over the years with classes and clients and colleagues, have found that a large number of people find it highly resonant and in fact, quite eye-opening often. Okay, and then we've got these three inner terms, okay, the three innermost terms. So when we synthesize together soul and persona, okay, the inwardness personality and the outwardness personality, right? We end up with our station. What's our station? Well, seems to be, I think, something of a Kabbalistic reference, right? So the tree of life in Kabbalah, the Oschim, the Severoth are sort of spheres, which are stations on this map. We'll talk a bit about that stuff later. And I think I got a video hanging around on my YouTube channel, if you can track it down in there. I'd have to tag it. But anyway, I'm fairly certain I have a video in there on that. Regardless, it's your station. What's your station? Your station is where you're at, right? If you synthesize together those two aspects, inwardness and outwardness, it tells you in some central sense where you are at right now. Not energetically, because that's what giant and dwarf are contending about, right? Motion, growth, but like where you're at right now, okay, is station. Okay, battle, on the other hand, synthesizes together giant and dwarf, or hero and villain, right, in my terminology. And so battle is a sense of like, how is the battle going? What is the battle right now, right? The synthesis between these two things is telling you something really significant about how the developmental energy is driving you forward and how the developmental energies holding you back are currently colliding. That's where battle lands. Okay, and then at the intersection of those things, station and battle, we have this final central term. And the final central term here is labeled destiny. Now, I have some problems with that, to be honest, okay? Station, right, reflects some sense of basic selfhood, okay? Station is some sense of basic selfhood, right? Inner and outer, some sense of basic selfhood. And battle, it's that progressive, regressive, it's got a tension and a balance, right? It's your personal task, it's the quest, it's the adventure, right? So destiny. The problem with destiny as a term is that it sounds predictive and it sounds fixed, right? It is your destiny, sounds fixed. And furthermore, it sounds like a prediction. It suddenly makes this whole thing seem like it's a fortune-telling tool, right? It's divination, and it's not. This isn't divination, let's be clear, okay? at least not in the sense that we're normally used to thinking of divination as a way of gaining access to the future. This isn't about the future. It's about gaining access to the present. What this task is intended to sort of reveal, if you happen to buy into the theoretical framework, and I think there are problems with it, but I think it's quite interesting. If you happen to sort of buy into the basic, premise of this thing, what it is meant to do is give you a snapshot of your dynamics. Now, you'll notice those dynamics don't map perfectly to Jung, and we'll talk about that, right? There's some definite similarity, but it's not quite perfect. And I think actually some of the places where they've tried to map it, where Daniels has tried to map it, it's a mistake. So like mapping the bottom left corner to shadow, in my opinion, is a mistake. I think that shadow is a line that gets drawn through this chart because it's very easy for aspects, or many different aspects of your psyche to be sort of in shadow, right? Same with functions, right? If there's no guarantee that you get a dominant function and it's conscious, and then one that's half conscious, one that's 1/4 conscious, and one that's unconscious. That's not how it works. You could have 3 relatively conscious ones. You could have 3 relatively unconscious ones. Like those balances and the progression people have to go through differ considerably. Well, same here. Your demon plays a certain kind of role, and so you're probably going to end up with a diagonal line, right, slashing through things. Your dwarf is regressive, and so it's hard to imagine how that would be psychologically integrated. But actually, your specter, right, such as it is, your tyrant, as I put it, can in fact become an ally, and that's something we'll talk about at greater length later. Likewise, although your guide is unlikely to fall under the sort of the line of darkness, your soul certainly can. Your soul certainly can. Your persona certainly can, right? Your persona can be tangled together with shadow. Your soul can be tangled together with shadow. If you have a bunch of material worked in with your material around, like the opposite sex, right? That classically is this tangling together of shadow, right? And that's a hard thing, right? When people have their contrasexual soul image, their anima or animus tangled together with shadow, then they're simultaneously experiencing like attraction and fear, and it's not as uncommon as you would think, right? Often, frankly, due to trauma. We all have trauma, but where that localizes, is the question. So I think that in some cases that mapping is problematic. The idea, though, is that it's a snapshot of the dynamics in your psyche, and that's my problem with destiny. That destiny as a term makes it sound like it's some unchanging thing that's in the future that you're inevitably going to go to, and I think that's the wrong way to think about it. A better way to think about it, in my opinion, and I mean, honestly, I've come up with other terms. Grail, I've used self, right? Self seems to me to be pretty straightforward. It's like, well, what is at the center of the Jungian system? Self, or the self, right? A way to think about it is this. It's a kind of snapshot that's the pivot point around which the rest of this system orbits. So your preoccupations, conscious and unconscious, will be at some level most highly expressed. And most people find that they end up with a very often a charged and abstract word there. Not invariably, and it's interesting to see the variations, as it is with all these words. If you track the language, who uses verbs, who uses nouns, who ends up with concrete words, who ends up with abstract ones, who's using adjectives. The people who just can't help themselves, they end up writing phrases instead of words. It's always interesting, and you can pull actually quite a bit of information out of doing sort of a loose analysis on what ends up in this center area. But I think it's important when you're considering this very central point, destiny, not to think about it as a prediction and not to think about it as fixed. Rather, what it is it's a sort of description of the present state of possibility and actuality. A description of the present state of possibility and actuality, given your current battle and your current relationship between the inner and the outer worlds. If you can hold that more complex notion in mind, then often, in fact, destiny as a slot, right, has an interesting sort of final word, right? It's a word that tends to umbrella the rest of the annular archetypes and color the interpretation. Okay, so I'm not going to say much more about this presently because there is a longer document, which I will send you next semester. But I wanted to run through this, so I hope that you find that elucidating, ideally thought-provoking. I would counsel you against chasing down additional information as yet. Like I said, all good things in time, and I will be certain to share sort of interpretive documents that you can work more deeply when you're doing your reflection piece on this and reflective analysis on this. But try not to chase stuff down in advance, partly because I don't want you to be looking at this excessively when we come back to it in the spring or late winter. The idea is partly to get the progression, right? To get your sense of how close or separate it seems to you, right? So anyway, the answer is save it, right? Take a photo, send it to me if you need to, or take a photo and send it to yourself, or scan it or stick it in a book, but don't lose it. Squirrel it away someplace, okay? And if for whatever reason you've completely ignored me and come to the end of this video without having actually done the test, why did you do that? So that's my question for you. Why? Why? Okay, good. So a little bit about Watchword. I'll post that up shortly. And let me think, between that and the student presentations, that's probably okay for tonight. I do want to post up stuff. I want to post up videos with commentary on Black Swan and Batman Begins, but maybe those can wait till next week. Also, I suspect that some people have not yet watched them. So if you haven't watched them, watch one or both of those films over Thanksgiving weekend. Okay, good. So I anticipate I will see people this evening. All right.